Hello and welcome to my channel, or welcome back to my channel. Hope everyone is doing well. Today I'm going to be reading you a true crime story from the book True Crime Stories, True Crime Anthology, Volume 8. The Murder of Dennis Jurgens. If I pronounce any names wrong or anything, I do apologize. Dennis Jurgens was an unfortunate 3-year-old boy who slipped through the cracks of the Minnesota social welfare system in the early 1960s and was given to a sadistic woman who tortured the boy to death. After little Dennis died, the case was largely ignored by law enforcement and the media in Minnesota until his birth mother began asking questions that could not be answered over 20 years later. Jerry Sherwood was a young woman who found herself in a nearly impossible situation in 1961. She had just learned that she was pregnant, and her boyfriend, who was a father, did not plan to stick around for the birth. She was on her own in the small town of Sauk Center, Minnesota. Sauk Center was the birthplace of famed American writer Sinclair Lewis, and it was also the inspiration for the setting of his 1920 novel Main Street. The novel did not take such a good view of the town, as it was portrayed as backwards, provincial, and dreary, although Lewis' characterization of his hometown may have been a bit extreme and unfair. It was in many ways just as conservative in 1961 as it was in 1920. The people of Sauk Center were, and still are, a combination of ardent Lutherans and Catholics who would have viewed Jerry Sherwood's pregnancy out of wedlock as unbecoming of a lady, to say the least. Sherwood was pressured by her family to give up her baby boy, which she regrettably did. Eventually, Sherwood moved on with her life, married, and had 2 more children, but she thought of her first child was never far from her mind. When adoptions became more open and better regulated during the 1970s and 80s, Jerry Sherwood decided that she would do what she could to find the son she gave up in 1961. She knew that the process would be difficult due to privacy concerns and the fact that it is nearly always the child who decides to look up the parent. Undeterred by the inherent obstacles she faced, Sherwood moved forward, and in doing so opened up one of the most heart-wrenching murder investigations in the state of Minnesota's history. At face value, the Jurgens appeared as a normal American family in the late 1950s. They were a working-class Roman Catholic family who lived in the St. Paul, Minnesota, a suburb of White Bear Lake. The father, Harold, provided a decent living for his wife, Lois, and their children, but by all accounts, he was a bit of a hen-pecked beta male. Lois was the true head of the Jurgens household, and she was not afraid to exercise her authority over her husband or children in front of friends, family, and neighbors. Lois Jurgens was born Lois Jurgens to a large Roman Catholic family of German background. There is nothing remarkable to speak of from what is known about Lois's early life other than her family truly was Catholic. Lois grew up with 16 other siblings. The large family that Lois grew up in provided a mental template for what she believed was an ideal family, large and well-disciplined. As a child, Lois attended Mass every Sunday with her family, took part in the church's sacraments, and regularly prayed using the rosary. The ritualized nature of some aspects of the Catholic Church appealed to Lois, who was later diagnosed as having obsessive-compulsive disorder. Life for most women in America was very different during Lois Jurgens' life than it is today. Few women went on to attend college after high school, with most instead finding clerical work with the ultimate intent of landing a husband. Lois Jurgens was very typical in this respect. After she graduated from high school, the strong-willed Lois set out to find a capable husband, which she did when she met Harold Jurgens. The two married and immediately tried to start a family, but there was one problem. Actually, there were several problems, most of which concerned Lois's mental faculties. Although mental disorders such as obsessive-compulsive disorder were little known during the 1950s, those close to Lois knew that she suffered from a fragile mental state. In those times, only the most enlightened and wealthy people in the biggest cities even knew what therapy was, and most drugs prescribed for mental illness today were at least a couple of decades in the future. Most Americans simply had to grin and bear their mental afflictions. The major problem that seemed to open the Pandora's box of mental issues in the Jurgens household was Lois's inability to conceive a child. When she learned that she could not have children of her own, it set off a series of tragic events that resulted in the death of Dennis Jurgens. Not long after learning that she could not bear a child, Lois's mental problems came to a head, and she was placed in a mental hospital. Lois's stay in the mental hospital probably made matters worse, as she was hospitalized numerous times during the 1950s. Each time she returned home to Harold, Lois seemed to be worse. She was depressed and rarely spoke or ate. When she did speak, it was only about her desire to have a child. The treatments did not seem to help Lois, which is not surprising considering some of the treatments doctors used at that time. On one of her mental hospital trips, she was even given the controversial electroconvulsive therapy, formerly known as electric shock therapy. Throughout her numerous sojourns in mental hospitals, one thing remained constant in Lois Jurgens' life. She wanted to have children, and by the late 1950s, it seemed as though Lois' numerous stays in institutions had finally started to pay off. She seemed more stable to friends and family and appeared ready to take on the responsibility of raising a family. The medical technology in the late 1950s and early 1960s was still about 20 years away from the process of in vitro fertilization, so the only option for couples in the Jurgens situation was adoption. Similar to today, the laws pertaining to adoption varied from state to state at the time, with Minnesota having some of the most stringent rules. Because of her history of mental illness, Lois was prohibited by the state of Minnesota from making an official adoption. But of course, where there is a will, there is a way. Undeterred, Lois and Harold privately adopted a boy they named Robert, and after more than a year of caring for their new child, resubmitted their application for the official adoption of another child. Officials from the state came to the Jurgens' home to determine if Lois had in fact overcome her mental health issues. Impressed by what they saw, the state allowed the Jurgens to officially adopt a child on a probationary basis. Not long after they were approved, they adopted Jerry Sherwood's toddler son, whom they named Dennis. To the state officials who were observing the Jurgens family during the probationary period of Dennis' adoption, everything seemed to be going well, but there were major problems just below the surface. Lois told friends and neighbors that she thought there was something wrong with Dennis, although witnesses later said that he acted like a normal boy his age. Despite Lois' misgivings about Dennis, she decided to go through with the adoption anyway and was approved by the state of Minnesota. Almost as soon as Dennis arrived at the Jurgens' home, he was tortured in the worst ways, physically, psychologically, and possibly even sexually. According to the Jurgens, neighbors, and Dennis' older adopted brother Robert, Lois's abuse of Dennis began almost immediately. Just months after the adoption was made official, Dennis was sent to the emergency room with burns to his genitals. It was later determined that the burns were part of the many corrective punishments Dennis received at the hands of his sadistic adopted mother. Lois's corrective punishments of Dennis were later said to be done to mold Dennis in an image that she thought was more suitable. They included both psychological and physical punishments that often left Dennis incapacitated for hours or even days at the time. It is normal for 2-year-old boys to be fussy about eating certain foods, if not most foods, but when Dennis refused to eat certain foods, Lois made him eat horseradish for punishment. The strong taste of the plant was too much for the child's palate, as he usually vomited as a result. Lois then made Dennis eat the vomit. When Dennis was not fed horseradish or vomit, he was usually being starved. Dennis only gained 3 pounds while he lived with the Jurgens family. and at the time of his death had nearly no substantious fat. Although Lois clearly had a deep hatred for the innocent toddler, in her twisted mind she believed that it was her duty to set Dennis on a righteous path. Despite being barely able to talk, Lois made Dennis recite the rosary with her, and if he failed, which was usually the case, because a 3-year-old has such a limited vocabulary, he was told that he was dumb and evil, or worse, he was often beaten. Lois certainly seemed to revel in the psychological torment she heaped on little Dennis, but the sadistic mother also showed an aptitude of physical violence. Lois beat Dennis repeatedly and often for little or no reason. If Dennis did something any boy his age would do, if he was in Lois' way, or if Lois was simply feeling sadistic, then Dennis would get a beating. And Lois showed little restraint during her beating sessions of Dennis. She would punch and slap his face as much as his body, apparently caring very little about what the neighbors or fellow parishioners at their church would think. To cover up her abuse of Dennis, Lois would make him wear sunglasses. As odd as many people thought it was to see a 3-year-old wearing sunglasses, unfortunately for Dennis, no one stepped in and said or did anything. As the abuse and beatings continued, they got much worse. Robert testified years later that he even saw Lois throw Dennis down a flight of stairs. But as bad as the physical and psychological tortures were, there is also evidence that Dennis endured sexual abuse. Lois openly told her friends and family that she was often placed a spring action clothespin on the tip of Dennis's penis to keep him from wetting himself. And the coroner who examined his body reported that there were bite marks and scars on his penis and scrotum. Little Dennis Jurgens endured pain and misery that no human should ever experience, and although he demonstrated incredible strength for a child to live as long as he did, he eventually succumbed to the torture and died on April 11, 1965, at the age of 3. Since Dennis was so young and he obviously did not die of natural causes, the Ramsey County coroner did a complete autopsy. In the report, the medical examiner noted that Dennis's body showed definite signs of abuse, with the official cause of death being ruled peritonitis due to the perforation of the small bowel. In other words, Dennis suffered so much physical abuse that his internal organs came undone. The medical examiner ruled the death deferred, which essentially left the case open since it was not ruled accidental. If further evidence were to be uncovered, it could have been changed to homicide. But Lois eventually had some influence in 1965. The immediate consequences of Dennis' murder resulted in Robert being temporarily taken from the Jurgens family, but no formal investigation was conducted. It turns out that one of Lois's brothers was a cop with White Bear Lake Police Department. Some who were involved with the case years later believed that Lois's brother destroyed evidence that would have provided Dennis's death was a homicide. Eventually, the Jurgens family got Robert back and were even allowed to adopt more children, but things did not turn out so well for the later adoptions either. The Jurgens was far from a happy family as Lois continued her abuse, although it was far less extreme than what Dennis endured. The Jurgens children ran away several times during the 1970s until the state of Minnesota finally stepped in and terminated Lois and Harold's parental rights. To those who knew the Jurgens family, it seemed as though the saga of abuse had ended, and the now late middle-aged couple had retired into obscurity. Harold and Lois sold their home in White Bear Lake and moved a few miles away to the city of Stillwater on the St. Croix River. By the 1980s, it seemed as though the world forgot about Dennis Jurgens. Jerry Sherwood had a difficult time in her early adulthood, but by the 1980s, things had turned around quite a bit, and she found stability and happiness. After she gave Dennis up for adoption, she met another man, married, and had 2 other children. In her mid-30s, Sherwood never would have dreamed she would become a private investigator. Ever since she gave Dennis up for adoption, she yearned for the day when they could be reunited. Once her life stabilized, she wanted her other children to meet Dennis, so she decided to do some amateur sleuthing by searching public records. She was devastated to learn that Dennis had died at the age of 3. Jerry gave up Dennis because she believed that he would have a better future with a more stable family. So when she learned he died so young, her feelings of inadequacy surfaced once more. But instead of dwelling on the situation, Jerry decided to look for answers. With a little more investigative work, Jerry was able to learn the identity of Dennis's adopted parents, which prompted her to make a call to Lois. Although Lois was polite, she was not very forthcoming about the manner of Dennis's death. The conversation was also ended abruptly, with Lois telling Jerry that she would send some of Dennis's personal effects in the mail. The package never arrived. Jerry then called Lois to see if she sent the package, but was perplexed to find out that her phone number had been changed to an unlisted number. Sherwood then tracked down Dennis's death certificate and was further puzzled by the listing as deferred. She was told that the categorization of deferred meant that the case was still technically open, although getting the authorities to look at the case would be an entirely different matter. Jerry Sherwood knew how to get people to listen to her. She first contacted the White Bear Lake Police Department, who showed some interest, and then went to the St. Paul Pioneer Press daily newspaper. The writers at the Pioneer Press took a deep interest in the case and published the details of Dennis's death in an October 12, 1986 story. Although Lois's name was left out of the story, her former neighbors, friends, and family members all knew who the sadistic woman was. A public outcry soon followed after the publication of the story, which led the Ramsey County Prosecutor's Office to charge Lois Jurgens with third-degree murder. The trial was covered heavily by Minnesota media outlets, and thanks to the testimony of Robert, Lois was convicted and sent to the women's prison of Shakopee, Minnesota. After serving over 8 years, Lois was released on parole and returned to Stillwater, where she lived until she died in 2013. Although the story does not have a truly happy ending, in the real world, most stories do not. It is incredible, though, that thanks to Jerry Sherwood, Lois Jurgens was served some justice for her despicable crimes. It is proof that the love of a mother extends beyond uncertain geographical distances and even beyond death. Thank you for listening. If you like this type of content, please consider subscribing and liking my channel, and I will see you on the next one.